Teacher pay, teacher training and student achievement. These are three education issues that always pop up in the media. But what do the real education experts have to say about them? Today I'm at the University of Sydney to talk to education expert Professor Debra Hayes about these key issues. The idea of performance pay for teachers is an evergreen issue that's always popping up in the media. In your opinion, what are the best arguments for and against it?
It does pop up, and it is an important issue, and so I guess that's why it keeps coming up. Everyone's interested in supporting young people's learning and giving them the best opportunities to learn. And when we think about how to do that, we obviously think of teachers as being a critical lever in enhancing young people's ability to learn and to do well. But teaching is a very distinct profession, and it's one that we need to understand very carefully in order to assess whether performance pay is a good idea or not. If you look at, say, a profession where performance pay exists, a common one might be in rugby league, for example.
Sure.
It's not unusual for league players to be paid at different levels according to their performance. But there's a very critical difference between playing on a rugby league field and teaching in a classroom, and that is that you have a level playing field. And that's not the case in teaching. Even teachers working in exactly the same school with the same kinds of conditions might have very different challenges in the classroom depending on who the young people are in their classes. So teachers can have up to 30 very different little minds that they're required to support and to teach. And we need to keep that in mind. It's not a level playing field for teachers, and so performance pay is perhaps not the best thing we should be considering.
Sure.
The other thing is, who do we give credit for students doing well or doing badly? Although, for example, we might say a teacher, the students in one teacher's class are doing well, is that because they were taught well last year? Is that because of the resources available? Is that because of maybe the external experiences, the outside experiences that kids have access to, extracurricular activities, the richness of the resources that are available to them? So we need to be very careful about this idea of performance pay because it can have unintended negative consequences. One of the things that makes schools great places is that teachers work together. It's that collectivity, that sense of a shared collective purpose in supporting everyone's learning. Teachers aren't just responsible for the children in their classes if they're primary school teachers. Teachers in secondary school schools teach across all the years. So teachers have a very strong sense of our collective responsibility. These are our kids, our school, our community. So a performance pay process is very much focused on individual performance. And I think it could disrupt that really valuable quality of teaching, that it's a collective and a collegial process. Sure, we could do it, but do we want to do it? You know, do we really want to risk again placing additional pressures and constraints on teachers? I think one of the other problems in terms of performance pay, performance suggests a range of repertoires, you know, and going back to the example of the rugby league player, you know, outstanding players, we can see how they have the physicality, the skill, the creativity, the ability to turn a situation, you know, from almost, you know, from one thing into something else, just through their creative ability. What we need to remember is that over the last few years, we've tightened down, we've really clamped down on teachers' ability to be creative and to exercise professional judgment. So the very conditions that would support teachers to develop creative, innovative repertoires are the the ones that we've actually weakened and undermined through through the increasingly standardised reforms.
Yep.
So teachers are increasingly being required to teach to the test, for example.
Yep.
Not that they want to do it, but there are very significant pressures on them to ensure that young people are performing well, for example, in NAPLAN tests, just as an example. And what that has tended to do is to actually limit the range of creativity and innovation that teachers feel they can access in the classroom.
Because it's so high stakes, yeah.
It's incredibly high stakes.
Yeah.
And so this would just be adding to that, you know, another pressure that would perhaps have quite the opposite effect of what we want. So I think we need to step back a little bit and to do a much stronger assessment of what have been the impact of the policies that we've already put in place before we put in another policy that's focused on performance, but this time the performance of teachers and of rewarding and incentivising that. The whole question of an increasing focus on performance of students has had some very negative impacts. No one's suggesting we don't want students to do well and that we don't want to know how they're doing. But when we create high stakes tests that then are made publicly available, then we create a situation of competition, of shame and of reward. And that's not a great environment to learn in.
Professor Dalton's study, which is a global index of 35,000 people across 35 countries, found that both teacher status and pay had a direct link to student achievement in the PISA test, or the Program for International Student Achievement. Do you think the correlation is that simple?
No, it's never that simple, and you know, we know that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causality, but there are some important lessons there, and I think this is what we need to do with any educational research is look at it in terms of, well, what kind of research is it? What's it telling us? What are the limits of what it's telling us? Yep. So, I mean, what's nice about the Global Teacher Status Index, which is Dalton's study, is that it's a very big study. You know, it's a huge study. So it gives us some interesting information. You've rightly connected it to status, and that's really what this is telling us, that in high status society, in societies where teachers are a high status profession, where they're highly regarded, where communities really respect and value their teachers, then there is, you know, it's not surprising that teachers are more inclined to, you know, feel valued and to contribute in ways that reflect that. And for those professions to be professions where people are
trusted.
You know, are trusted to do what we pay them to do. We don't have that situation in Australia. You know, it's really sad to see that most of the reporting of teachers over the last, particularly since the reporting of NAPLAN results and PISA results, has been very negative about teachers. And it's not just that, but we need to be aware that when we do associate and blame teachers for students' results, for example, which often happens, and that's partly where the whole issue of performance pay, the whole question of looking at performance pay now, it's about, you know, what do we need to attribute to teachers in terms of their responsibility for the test results. That's essentially what it's about. Sure. So whenever we do that, whenever we talk, it does matter what we say about teachers, it does matter how we talk about them, and I think what the Dalton study really reminds us is that when teachers in a society are highly regarded, highly respected and well paid, then they're the good conditions in which we get high levels of performance from students. And that's not to say that our teachers in Australia are not highly competent, very good professionals, highly committed to increasing young people's learning outcomes, but the conditions around them, what we say about them, and the lack of trust that is often associated with the kinds of policies that are implemented, say quite the opposite.
The LandTite, which is the initial literacy and numeracy test for graduate teachers, was introduced to ensure these teachers possess adequate literacy and numeracy skills to enter classrooms. Shouldn't we consider lifting the ATAR entry scores for teachers across the country too? Why? Why not?
Well, it's interesting because most of the people coming into initial teacher education programs across the country don't come in via ATAR entry.
Okay.
So that's one aspect. It's only one way in which people come in. And there's great variation between universities in the relevance of ATAR.
Okay.
So when I say the relevance of ATAR, lifting ATAR, for example, for us, it's not a huge issue because most of our students already have very high levels of ATAR. This is really a question of, do we trust the universities, and in particular those in initial teacher education, to firstly select suitable people and then to develop them to be good quality teachers? That's really what these issues are about. LandTite is a way of checking that that's been done. The suggestion of lifting the ATAR entry is another way of, in a sense, constraining the professional judgment of initial teacher educators to select their incoming students. Now, it's, again, I think it's a too big a stick for a small problem. In the sense that no one questions the fact that we want the best quality people coming in to do initial teacher education and to become our teachers. So I don't want to suggest in any way that those in initial teacher education aren't concerned about the quality of the graduates that they produce and of the people that come into the programs. The issue is really about a few things. One is the whole idea of an initial teacher education program is to take someone and to develop them into a teacher. And we have great confidence that if we get people who are committed to teaching and who really desire to teach, then we can turn them into a teacher. The thing is, by lifting ATAR or by playing with the entry, if you like, trying to stop certain people at the gate, what we tend to do is then stop people who might be very good teachers.
And really committed to it. Could be a disservice in a way.
And could be very good. So one of the problems of, say, for example, lifting ATAR is it means that some people who have had background experiences that might be reflected in a low ATAR, so not everyone thrives at school for a whole lot of reasons. So by saying that, I'm simply saying ATAR doesn't necessarily tell us whether someone's going to be a good teacher or not. It probably tells us more about, it might tell us something about their natural ability, but it might also tell us about what group they come from. So some groups in our communities simply don't do it as well at school as others, and that's my whole research area. How come schools don't serve some groups of children as well as they do others? The most common example is young Aboriginal children and Torres Strait Islander children. Their results at school are increasing, but they don't generally do as well at school as non-Indigenous kids. That's not because of any natural difference, it's because of the conditions of schooling and society that make it much harder for those kids to do well at school. You know, it's a much bigger range of issues, but we really want to encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people to come into teaching. You know, we really need them in teaching. And many of them are doing increasingly well and getting very high ATARs. But we also don't want to artificially stop some people from entering teaching who may become very good teachers. So I think it's again comes back to an issue of trust. And just like within our society we tend not to trust teachers terribly much, that's how we've gone, we also tend not to trust initial teacher educators very much either. And I think it's very sad because initial teacher educators are deeply committed to improving the status of the profession, and deeply committed to creating excellent teachers. And I think what we really are asking for is the ability not to be too constrained in that. The reasons why some students may continue to fail at Lantite as well, most students will pass Lantite.
It's a very small number, isn't it?
Without any problems at all. It's a very small number, and what we need to look at is the fact that it is a test, it's an examination, and that some people simply don't do well in tests. They just don't. And for some people it can be an incredibly stressful situation. So we need to look at a case-by-case basis and ensure that, again, we're not preventing someone from joining the profession who might make an excellent contribution to it. And an arbitrary, in a sense, barrier can sometimes prevent us from welcoming into the profession people who really should be there, particularly if they've done 4 years of training in an initial teacher education program. So I think these are responses that are well-meaning and well-intended, but we need to continually look at what the negative effects are of these policies.
And keep them in perspective too.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. What do you think gave rise to this slip down the international rankings in literacy and numeracy that we've seen in PISA, for instance, and can we ever get back up?
Look, it's a really interesting question, our performance on PISA, and we really need to understand the PISA tests. So these are the international tests that are run in cycles by the OECD. And what we have seen is that our performance on PISA, since it first started in 2000, has gradually declined. And that is a worry. Like, what's that all about? How come Australian students, their performance is gradually declining? So we need to look at it and we need to ask questions. But we also need to understand the test. The test is about how young people apply what they learn at school to real-world problems. So it's a very specific kind of test. It's telling us that over that period, the ability of Australian students to look at a real-world problem and to offer some solutions to it is dropping. It's not telling us that, it's not telling us that our students are performing less well on, say, literacy and numeracy and all of those things. We looked in that plan and other things for those kinds of measures, and they may not tell us that either, but they tell us something. So we need to ask, what are these tests telling us? So that's a concern. But there's also some answers in the PISA results, because what PISA focuses on is not just performance, but on who's performing well or who's not performing well. And so consistently now the PISA results have raised for us in our society the very important question of equity. And what we do see is that there are very big differences in how well different groups of students do on the PISA results. And so we have a very large group of students in low equity groups, so young people who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, some young people from languages other than English, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And we need to look carefully. It's not everyone in those groups. Again, we can look at those groups and say there are groups within groups who are not doing well. But the PISA results allow us to look at that, and they have been sending up a red flag for Australia for a number of years now about equity and how we're not doing as well as similar countries in closing that equity gap.
Okay.
So I think the question is not so much what do PISA results tell us about young people's performance, but what do PISA results tell us about our education systems and how we educate young people and the kinds of policies that we're choosing. And what it's telling us is that whatever else, whatever else we're doing in education seems to be clamping down, seems to be reducing young people's ability to apply what they learn to real world problems. Now, in the 21st century, when a lot of people say that's increasingly what we need our young people to be doing, to be able to take the knowledge they learn in schools and apply it elsewhere, that's a big concern.
It is.
But it also raises concerns. What's going on in our schooling system that these equity gaps aren't closing, and that we still have what's often described as a long tail of equity in terms of results, that there's a very, very large group of young people who simply aren't doing well and not doing as well as they should.
Are international rankings like PISA so important for us?
Well, we didn't have them not so long ago. We do have them now, and so they've more recent ways of gauging our performance compared to other countries, and within Australia of making some kind of assessment of our education systems. I think what we need to be really careful of is how we use those results. So I think we can excuse a kind of a poor practice around the use and discussion of these kinds of indicators because they have been fairly new, you know. And when you first are presented with new information, it takes a little while to understand it. What is it actually telling us? How can we use it sensibly? We need to remember that that particularly, for example, with our NAPLAN results, the fact that we report our NAPLAN results, the fact that we make it a public sort of performance has an impact on schooling systems, and it really drives competition between schools. Now, some people might say that's a good thing, and there may be elements of it that are a good thing, but we need to look closely at the impact. And coming back to the discussion of our PISA results and the fact that we have a real problem around equity in Australia and in raising the gap between equity groups, we need to look at the impact of competition between schools on equity groups. So, are all of our young people attending schools where they're getting access to the same kinds of resources and the same kinds of opportunities? That's a really important question. And the way in which schools are currently funding and the variation in the funding levels between schools would suggest that's not the case, and that we've got some young people attending schools, particularly, for example, young people in country towns, young people in some parts of large metropolitan areas where they don't have equal access to the same kinds of resources as others. So we're getting these place differences in the type of education that is available. So when we drive markets, when we create markets, then we have these unintended effects of making some places more desirable to teach, to live than others, and some schools more desirable to attend than others. And so these are some of the influences that come from the continual reporting of results. So as a society, we need to become more intelligent and about how we understand these results. What are they telling us? but also what are the effects they're having. So we're now reaching, as you said, we've had over 10 years of NAPLAN reporting. We can now look back and say, well, what has been the impact of that reporting? So the questions we can ask are not just what's happening to student performance, but what are the impacts of the test reporting on student performance and on what's happening in the classroom. So these tests and these international tests are not kind of neutral indicators of systems of schooling. They're actually driving certain kinds of behaviours within those systems. And that's what we need to be much more focused on. What are the unintended and perhaps perverse negative consequences of some of the reporting systems that we have in place?
Professor Debra Hayes, thank you so much for speaking to Education Review.
My pleasure.